Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Uplift. Joining me this week is the Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition in Canada, Alex Schadenberg. So, hi Alex, it's great to have you here all the way from Canada. It's not often that I have an expert on the topic of euthanasia in studio, so I'm excited to dive into this. There's a host of life issues happening in society at the moment. I'm sure most of us would agree. What is it that drives your passion in advocating against assisted suicide compared to other life issues?
Well, I actually only focus on euthanasia and assisted suicide. I'm actually pleased to be in the UK right now. I know this is going to be played a few times, but this is around the time now where a bill's being introduced pretty soon in Westminster. This is sadly a great threat to your own country to legalize assisted suicide, because the private members bill is going to be getting a lot of support from your current Prime Minister, your new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who's been a long time supporter and promoter of assisted suicide. So, and I've been involved with this work now for 25 years. And, you know, what's interesting about having a long history, I know a lot about Keir Starmer, even though I'm a Canadian, because he was your former Director of Public Prosecutions. And at that time, he created prosecution guidelines around assisted suicide, which made it very difficult to prosecute someone for an assisted suicide. So this is the reality that you're facing, and hopefully that bill will be defeated. But this issue of euthanasia, assisted suicide, I actually got involved in it for a few reasons a long time ago. One was it was being debated in Canada, and there was actually very few people who had made that an issue that they primarily focused on. The second issue was that I have my wife and I have a son who has autism, and we were, getting involved with things around the Autism Society, because they obviously had services and they were connected in such a way that we could get the services we needed for our son. And we went to a lot of their events, and it became quite apparent to me the attitude towards people with disabilities was very different than other people, able-bodied people, etc. And as I say, at the same time, we had several issues in Canada going on around this issue of assisted suicide, euthanasia, and the two just sort of molded together for me, and I've been involved with this ever since the 1990s. It's a very long time.
Yeah, it's a very long time indeed. Now, for our viewers watching, can you explain to them what is the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide?
That's a very good question, because a lot of people get that confused, the difference between euthanasia and assisted suicide. And the other issue, of course, is the difference between withholding withdrawing medical treatment and euthanasia, because they're also very different. Euthanasia and assisted suicide are actually quite similar. What it is with euthanasia, it's a form of homicide. So Canada legalized euthanasia by creating an exception to homicide in our criminal code. So our, the rules around murder. I'm not allowed to murder you in Canada, but if I'm a physician and another physician or nurse practitioner in Canada were to sign off and say it's okay to kill you, after your request that is, then we can go ahead and do so. And in fact, the law was designed in such a way that it's pretty safe. Like, it's almost impossible in Canada to prosecute a doctor even for the most ridiculous reasons of approving an assisted death. So it's the doctor actually doing the act. Assisted suicide would be where the doctor prescribes the same lethal drugs, which I call poison, because it's really a poison if you think about how the concoction is really put together. But you have to take it yourself. So the difference is not the intention. The intention is to cause death. The difference is not the drug concoction. They're very, very quite similar with assisted suicide and euthanasia. The difference is how it's done. In euthanasia, the doctor, or in Canada also nurse practitioners, they do it to you. Either it's by injection, or it's by, they often will do it by hooking up an IV line, and then they put it into the IV. That's the other way they often do it. And with assisted suicide, you'd have to mix it in some sort of drink and drink it down and do it yourself. The two are very then confused in the sense that one can become the other. So in the U.S., where you have assisted suicide legal but not euthanasia, well, there's 10 states in the U.S. Out of the 50 states, 10 of them have legalized assisted suicide. They don't have euthanasia, but I mean, if a situation occurred where the person wasn't dying after taking the lethal poison, or if another situation happened where it was difficult for that person to swallow, you could see how, because the application could easily be done by another person.
Yeah.
Assisted suicide and euthanasia sometimes become exactly the same thing,
yes.
even though one would call it assisted suicide. The end result could be, it ended up being a homicide, which would be euthanasia.
That's insane.
Now, I'm going to get into the medical treatment question because a lot of people confuse them, and they'll say, well, what about withdrawing medical treatment? Well, you know, there's obviously concerns with that because, you know, if I have a medical situation and, you know, I can be effectively treated, then withdrawing treatment, sometimes the intention can be the same idea. But to withdraw treatment from someone in the normal sense could result in a natural death, but no one actually killed them. So let's say we're talking about someone who is receiving cancer treatment and they say, I don't want any more of that. If the person dies, they didn't die because someone killed them. And I say if the person dies, because when you withdraw treatment, they don't always die. You know, sometimes they continue living. Sometimes actually they do quite well. But the point of it is that if they die, it's a natural death, whereas euthanasia is actually an intentionally caused death.
Yes.
And you can see the difference between them.
We know that many vulnerable people feel pushed towards this assisted suicide. What are the types of pressures that are leading people down this path?
So in my own country of Canada, we've actually had a lot of crazy stories around euthanasia, and it actually began from the beginning. But how this is that when someone gets approved for a euthanasia death, did they freely actually choose? Is this about freedom, or were they also in a situation where they're being influenced by another? So let me just sort of lay this out. In Canada, because it was legalized, but you know, doctors and nurses are then dealt with by provincial regulation, because in Canada healthcare is provincial, but the criminal code is federal. Therefore, how they looked at it is because they said doctors and nurses must do this, and it became then under the provincial mandate to carry it out, it was seen as medical treatment. Okay. So now the problem is, you are then being told that, or doctors and nurses are being told, everyone has the right to know all their options. Now that makes sense in most situations. Let's say you have some sort of illness and they say, well, we really have two different types of treatment that we can offer you. Treatment A, treatment B. Treatment B won't be so harsh on you, but it's maybe less effective. Treatment A is very harsh on you, but it's actually more effective. You can make your choices, and that's sort of a fair game. But when we're actually now talking about euthanasia, killing someone, what you're now having is doctors and nurses are being told, well, you have to offer all the choices. So therefore, someone has cancer, they're being told, well, you can have this treatment, you can have this treatment. Oh, by the way, you can have medical aid in dying. So when the doctor or the nurse are now the ones bringing it up, you can see how that influences someone, especially going through a difficult time of their life. And this is what we're seeing in Canada. But then there's also the other side, is the social pressure. And I think that's the greater issue. Because there's a lot of people who are going through great difficulties and they have a health problem. Let's say it's a person with a disability who's having significant chronic issues in their health. They might not be terminal, but you don't need to be terminal in Canada. So they have a chronic condition. And they are dependent on our government disability benefit. Now the problem with that is post-COVID, we've had massive inflation in Canada, massive inflation. It's just sort of settling down. I've heard you had a similar thing happen in the UK. So what's happening is we had the case of Amir Farsu. Amir, and we've had several cases like this actually. Amir is a man who lived in, he's alive today, so he lives in St. Catharines, Ontario. He had a subsidized apartment unit. So what happened is the building was sold to a new owner, and they decided to refurbish the building, and they told Amir, you have to leave. But on his disability allowance, he was unable to find anywhere he could afford to live. So because of his disability, he qualified for euthanasia. He then applied for, and he was approved for euthanasia. And the sad thing is he even said in all the TV interviews he did, he said, well, I told the doctor I'm actually not interested in euthanasia, but I cannot, with my health condition, be homeless. I can't live on the streets. So he said, I can't afford a place to live. There's nowhere I can find, but I can't live on the streets. So he said, rather than living on the streets, I'd rather die. So then this is all supposed to be about freedom of choice and autonomy, yet he's saying, So he was still approved for death. What happened is it hit the news, this whole story. Somebody had contacted CTV News. They did an interview with him. And then somebody else then started a GoFundMe page, and they raised enough money for him that he was able to find a place to live. But these are the kind of stories we're getting. We had a story out of Mississauga. So the Mississauga Food Bank. So this is a food bank. It's got nothing to do with issues of euthanasia, assisted suicide, disability. They deal with just poor people who are needing food assistance. Yeah. And they reported that they were shocked. This was in 2022, that they were shocked that they had a number of people who they were helping out who were applying for an assisted death because they say they were too poor to live this way. So these are the kind of things you get. So is this what you call overt pressure? We do get some of that too. I'll tell that story next. Yeah. But I mean, the fact of it is or in the next questions, the fact of it is that that those type of pressures are social pressures that really drive people to asking to be killed. Yes.
It's awful. It's so tragic. And I can imagine for those with little family members to advocate for them when they are in pain, that coercion can take place. Have you seen this happen?
Okay, so the question about pain is very interesting, as you say, and coercion, because this is a reality. But the greater reality that I'm finding is that there's a lot of people today, now that this is legal, it's seen as a legal option in our country, Canada, and it's being offered to them because they're saying, well, you have to offer everybody, all the choices, all of the opportunities, So what's happening, you've got a lot of people today who are going through a difficult time. They might not be in a ton of pain, but they might be in fear of pain. That's more common than you think, actually. People who actually aren't in this intractable pain that's uncontrolled, but they're in fear of what might happen. But at the same time, because of the way culture has gone, they feel that they have nobody in their life. And this is far more common than we think. So even if you consider maybe, I don't know how many people you would know, but people who are listening to us, there's a lot of people who are in a situation where they were married, they had children, now they're older, they might be now, a widow, and their children don't live near them. Then they have some health issues, so now they're having difficulties getting around. So they might have had a very excellent social life. Now they're having difficulties getting out. They might have difficulties with, walking, etc., or certain health issues. Well, you find yourself in a very lonely environment then. Yeah, indeed. And the culture has become also far more self-oriented rather than how it used to be. The culture used to be far more into the interconnectedness, whether it was intentionally that way or just previous to all this social media. People tended to be more part of a community, visiting each other, part of this sort of interconnected nature, which is normal to the human person. And we've become far more individualistic. So what you actually find is people going through a difficult time in their life, and then they're saying, well, maybe an assisted death is a good idea because I see no purpose to my life. So when we talk, I always talk about this and I say, well, look what it means to be human. Look at the reality of the culture today. And then the other side says, oh, this is about freedom, choice, and autonomy. I said, first of all, it's not about freedom. There's nothing free about being killed. It's actually an ending to your freedom. It's about choice. Well, for most people, it's really not about choice. They might be going through a very difficult time, etc. These aren't just like choices. Is it about autonomy? Well, it's actually never about autonomy, because when somebody else kills you, because that's euthanasia, and in assisted suicide, someone else is directly involved with killing you. When somebody else is directly involved with the act, this now cannot be defined as autonomy anymore. It is actually about abandonment. People going through a difficult time of their life. We're now abandoning them to death rather than providing them the interconnections that they need. And this is the more common issue.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't heard that one before. And also on the other side of this is that some family members who have, let's say, a lot of people in their network, then on the opposite side of that, can coerce the sick person into assisted suicide or euthanasia. Is this correct?
Well, what you get is a situation that certain family members might be, how would you say, wondering when it's going to be done. So the issue of dying is that it doesn't just happen. The human body goes through a process as we're coming to the end of our life. And so sometimes death can come on reasonably quick and it's natural, but sometimes it takes a while. And people start wondering, well, when is it going to be done? And you think about this, who's the person who's actually suffering? The person who's nearing death, or the people who are around who are wondering, when is mom going to be dead? This is the funny thing that actually starts going on with these situations. And there's also the issue of the fact that some people have a fair amount of resources. So the next generation is wondering when they're going to acquire those resources. And you're thinking, well, that's not true. Well, we've actually seen quite a few cases like that where people have said, well, they're sort of feeling pressured by the situation. Because remember, it's legal. It's a legal option. The doctors who are approving you are only looking at the question, does this person, in our country, it's based on an irremediable medical condition. Does this person have an irremediable medical condition? Are they experiencing some level of suffering? Well, as a human being, they might be experiencing some level of suffering. That would be sort of normal almost. So it's easy then, in a sense, to qualify. But there's lots of pressures. The greater pressures we see are actually now in the medical system. So Heather Hancock wrote this amazing story about what happened to her. Very powerful. She's a woman who has cerebral palsy. And so obviously she's had that from birth. And she was in the hospital recently, and she was shocked how she was pressured towards euthanasia. Now, she had no interest in euthanasia. She wasn't asking for it. She wasn't saying, oh, by the way, I'm wondering if you can, dispense of me or anything like that. Yeah. But what happened is this nurse came to her. Now remember, she's a woman with a disability. Yeah. This nurse came to her early in the morning, so this was before breakfast, as she's explaining. The nurse says to her, do the right thing. You should be requesting MAID. They call it MAID in Canada, medical aid in dying. They come up with this terminology to make you feel better about killing. Anyway, and Heather's like, I'm not interested in MAID. And then the nurse says to her, you're not actually living, you're just existing. Now, could you imagine being told that? Now, you would say, well, what would give the nurse such an audacity to say that kind of thing? Now, the one thing is she was talking to Heather in this case, and Heather wasn't interested at all. Heather is a great example of someone who is a powerful advocate for life, and she's a wonderful example of someone who really, even though she might have some difficulties in life, she's been very effective, and she's an author. She does a lot of editing. So if you need if you wrote a book and need it edited, she's a fabulous editor and things like that. So the fact of it is Heather wants to live, but this nurse. So let's say you were in another situation where you're actually sort of down and it's quite depressed, and you're in the same type of state, and now the nurse is coming to you. You could see how that kind of pressure would cause someone to maybe say, yes, I would rather be dead. I agree with you.
Yeah, I can see how that would. There are many people who are disabled who disagree about assisted suicide, such as actress Liz Carr, who has a disability, who spoke out against assisted suicide in her latest documentary. I suppose from your experience, I know you mentioned that story, how do people living with a disability respond to the debate around assisted suicide?
Okay, so the interesting thing is it depends on who you are with a disability, because people with disabilities sort of vary, and we live in a very secular culture, so there is obviously a group of people with disabilities who might actually not view themselves within that whole disability paradigm. Somebody like Liz Carr, who's become a strong disability activist, she understands clearly how having a disability within this culture and legalizing assisted suicide would clearly then threaten the lives of people with disabilities. And I think that's very important, because most of the people who I've been dealing with in the disability community, who are disability leaders, who are trying to, whether they're lobbying the government for more supports, or they're involved with providing services to people in the communities, etc., they're opposed to this because they recognize the reality of life with a disability and attitudes towards people with disabilities. So, if you're already, demanding, how being forced to demand that you receive equality in medical treatment, you can imagine how when you're being pressured to say no to medical treatment because people look at you and say you're futile, when in fact the treatment would be a benefit, that you should also wonder why they would also be pressuring you to die, when in fact you want to live, and you have a treatable condition, but someone looks at you and says your life's not worth living. This is the reality of what we're facing. So, that doesn't mean that everyone feels this way. Sadly, there are people with disabilities who are asking for their life to be ended. So in Canada, we had the original law included a terminal illness type part of the law. You had to be terminally ill even though it wasn't defined. The Canadian law is not defined. It's a serious problem. They gave us a law that they intended, it was intentional to have it expand quickly. But one of the things in the original law said that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable. That was then challenged in the courts by two people with disabilities in Quebec. Both of these people were living in institutions. So really, in fact, one of them was quite clear in the media that if they had a life outside of an institution with care that they could actually live on their own, etc., they wouldn't be interested in this whatsoever. So right off the bat, the question is this about discrimination, or is this about freedom? Anyway, they argue that the law discriminated against them because they were not terminally ill, so therefore they couldn't have euthanasia. But if they were terminally ill, they could have euthanasia. And the court actually agreed with them, and that's how they struck down that part of the law. And of course, Trudeau was happy to bring in a wider law, and he actually went further than that. But anyway, the fact of it is yes, sadly there are people with disabilities who are feeling this whole situation. In London, Ontario, we have this man named Roger Foley. You might have read stories about Roger Foley. You can Google Roger Foley. Roger Foley has cerebral ataxia, and he lives in the hospital in London, Ontario. He doesn't actually want to live in the hospital. He actually wants to live in his home.
What is it? Sorry, what was the condition?
He has cerebral ataxia, so he's got a degeneration of his. It's a lot like quite similar, but not identical in any way. It has similar outcomes to ALS, meaning he's lost a lot of control over his muscle ability. He's unable to walk. He's now in a situation where he does need he needs 24-hour care. He would have a very difficulty feeding himself, etc. He can't really get around without people helping him, etc. But the fact of it is he's happy to be alive. He's been pressured now on several occasions by the hospital to die by euthanasia. And this is the kind of thing, and you'd say, well, how could they do that? Well, they look at his life and they say, well, Roger, and this is actually the one time, there was this one bean counter that came into his room and had a meeting with him. It was like, Roger, you have two choices. You could pay the hospital. It was at that time $1,500 a day and stay here. Well, of course, he doesn't have $1,500 a day to pay them. Or you can have euthanasia. Those are the choices they gave him. So instead, he went to the media and said, and he recorded that conversation too, so he could prove to the media that he wasn't lying to them. But this is the kind of thing you get.
Wow, I'm lost for words because it's just so bleak. In England, Lord Falconer is currently pushing for the assisted suicide bill. Yep. He's stating that safeguards will be in place to stop coercion and make sure that the process is safe, as safe as possible. What have you to say about that?
So Lord Falconer and most of these bills are quite similar. So what I'm saying is it's far more difficult to legalize assisted suicide or euthanasia in a country than it is to expand the bill later. Meaning once it's legalized, there seems to be a natural pressure to expand it once it's legal. So therefore, the difficulty that they have is legalizing it. So we see this very much in the US. Now, why am I bringing up the US? Because the US has 10 states that have legalized assisted suicide, but in the last 3 years, the assisted suicide lobby has spent millions of dollars pushing it, and like this year alone, they had 25 states that they had bills in to legalize assisted suicide, and they failed in all 25 states. So what they're doing is they come up with a bill that looks quite tight.
Yeah.
But at the same time in the US, you're seeing all the states that have legalized are expanding their legislation.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's the same thing that they would do here. It's the same thing they did in Canada. So in Canada, we legalized in 2016, and in 2021, we expanded the law to remove the terminal illness requirement. We removed the waiting period. We removed the requirement that the person be competent at the time of death, and we added in euthanasia for mental illness alone. Wow. So that was in less than 5 years. We went from a law that was actually not defined, but at least had some sort of parameters to it, to a law that was completely wide open. In the US, you're seeing that most of the states that legalize assisted suicide. So another example is, for instance, in California, they legalized assisted suicide in 2016, and then they passed a bill in 2021 to expand their law. They passed another bill after that to do another expansion. This is the kind of thing you get, because the resistance to legalization is greater than the resistance to expansion. So obviously Lord Falconer is doing his math, and he's realizing, I have to get the majority to support my bill, and the way to do that is to sell it as a tight bill, because there's some people who might be saying, well, I technically support assisted suicide, but I don't feel comfortable with it because I can see what's happening in other jurisdictions. And he's going to say to them, we're not other jurisdictions. In the UK, that's what he's going to say, in the UK, we're going to keep it tight. It's only going to be for the few. The problem with that concept is that's exactly what they said in Canada. Yeah. That's exactly what they said in California. That's exactly what they said everywhere, that we will not be expanding it. We will keep it tight here. But in fact, what you get is you get this expansion. Now, the expansion is actually normal once you legalize, because what happens is once you legalize it, now the goalpost is immediately shifted. Now, why am I saying that? You have to justify certain things to legalize it, but once it's legal, you're allowing killing. So the concept of the bright line that says I can't kill you has now been removed. So what becomes the new goalpost? Well, the current law then becomes the goalpost, but it's not a real goalpost at all because you already allow killing. So in Canada, what we had is the argument around discrimination. They said, well, if you have a terminal illness, you can have euthanasia, but if you have a chronic illness, you can't have euthanasia. Well, that's discrimination. And that would be the same thing that would happen
here. Same would happen here, and we can see that. It doesn't take a genius to see those trends in Canada, in the US, and all over.
Well, look at the Netherlands, look at Belgium.
Yeah, that's my next question.
The next question about the Netherlands. Well, the Netherlands have actually never changed their law. But they've had massive expansion. So their experience is a little different. So what the Netherlands bill, law, it's been in place since 2002, it was passed 2001. The Netherlands law has never changed, but they've changed the interpretation of the law. So the Netherlands is in a totally different situation. Now, they could have done it the same way in Canada, but that wouldn't have made Trudeau happy because he was, he wanted to expand. So obviously this was the quicker and easier way. So in the Netherlands, if you look at actually their legislation, it was similar to Canada where it wasn't defined. So from the beginning, it was designed to expand. And then so over the years, they've changed the interpretation of its meaning. So prime example, I've been in this since, I started this work full-time in 1999. So if you start looking at that, at that time, in the beginning when they legalized euthanasia in the Netherlands, they did not allow euthanasia for mental illness. Now, if you look at the data, it's about 2 to 3% of all deaths are euthanasia from mental illness.
In the Netherlands?
In the Netherlands.
Okay.
So they changed, so that was changed around 2009. So, and then when you're looking at the data, it was around 2010 you see these first euthanasia deaths from mental illness alone. And there was only a couple, and then it's been growing ever since. So you get these changes, and that's not the only change to their law, but I mean it's a change of interpretation that they had in the Netherlands.
And also in the Netherlands and Belgium there is euthanasia for children. It seems to be that they will try to kill you before they try and heal you. In Canada at the moment it's trying to expand to euthanasia for children. Is this true?
Okay, so we haven't had legislation yet, but we had a committee report. So the government, it's funny how the government works. When they legalized euthanasia in 2016, the Canadian government, they added into the bill just to make some of the people who were sort of concerned about things. They said, well, we're going to put in a 5-year review. So there was a mandatory 5-year review in our original legislation, which was mandated to begin in June of 2020. Well, of course, the government didn't do that. Instead, they expanded the bill, which happened in March of 2021. And then after they expanded the law in March of 2021, then they announced they were going to have a committee. But then the committee was not based on what the original legislation said it was going to be about. They actually only examined further expansions of the law. So then the committee report came out saying that Canada needed to expand euthanasia to mature minors.
Mature minors. And so what age is that, mature minors?
So mature minor is not based on an age, it's based on an assessment. So let's say you have a 13-year-old girl, just as an example.
Yeah.
So often they would say, oh, they're talking about, 14 to 18-year-olds, but it's not based on age, it's based on assessment. So you might have a 13 or let's say a 12-year-old girl, wouldn't matter, just an example, who has a medical condition and who's wanting euthanasia. Then she would then be assessed as to whether she's competent or not to request that. So you get the same thing in the UK, the question about mature minors. Let's say someone needs medical treatment, and the child might say, I don't want that treatment, but the treatment would truly be beneficial to them, and that you might have parents saying, oh, well, we want our child to have that treatment. Let's say, I don't know, we don't have to name a condition, but the child doesn't want the treatment. Then they would assess the child, and if the child is declared to be a competent or mature minor, then the child's refusal would then be accepted. Yeah. So anyway, this is the situation we get. But also they want euthanasia by advance directive. So advance directive means I would write into my legal document that I would want euthanasia if I became incompetent, whether that be from Alzheimer's, dementia, or let's say a car accident. I could have a car accident, and then I have a head injury from that car accident, so I'm not capable of making decisions for myself. And then they could go ahead and kill me if I did that ahead of time. But the importance about all that question is the issue of what does this actually mean? So when we legalized euthanasia in Canada, they said to us, which is the same thing they said to you in the UK, it's only for competent adults who are capable of consenting. They said that over and over and over again in Canada. But obviously people who put in their advance directive or children are not competent adults who are capable of consenting.
Surprise, surprise, it's all fluff. Now, denying euthanasia access is seen by some people as lacking compassion. They'll be screeching at you saying you have no compassion. There are people who say we should allow assisted suicide so that people don't have to live in pain. What would you say to that?
So when when you're debating this question, what you're going to see is, and you've already seen it in the UK, you're going to see a lot of stories about people who are going through difficult health conditions, and it's going to be the whole story will have one big theme. So-and-so is suffering, and it's compassionate to kill them.
I finished your sentence.
I know.
That's what it's...
But that's what you're seeing.
Yeah, that's what we're kind of seeing
exactly
everywhere.
what happened in Canada. In Canada, we were inundated with story after story after story about people who were going through difficult health conditions, and we were told it was compassionate to kill them. Well, you see, in fact, that is not the reality in most circumstances. So I'm not suggesting that no one is going through suffering.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that at all.
We're aware of
but
that.
I am suggesting to you that we can deal with that suffering with proper medical care. We can deal with the suffering with proper medical care. But most people actually don't ask for it for that reason. Now, I know that seems sort of academic because the media, when they're telling you a story about someone who's suffering, obviously it seems, that we lack compassion. We say, well, that's not necessary. But my response is always, well, why are they suffering? Why did they not receive the care that they needed? Why is it necessary to kill them? Why are you saying to me it's necessary to kill them? See, for me, I oppose killing people. So this is the difference you got to get. I will say to you, okay, so what your answer is to legalize euthanasia or assisted suicide, and the only way you can actually do that in law is if you give doctors or nurses, in Canada it's also nurse practitioners, right, the right in law to kill you, because you have to do that, right? Because the law says I can't kill you. So therefore, the only way to make this possible is to create that exception. So now you have a law which gives a group of people the right in law to kill you. Do you feel comfortable with that?
Absolutely not.
Right. Well, that's the whole idea.
I'm not the only one. There's loads of people.
Well, I feel uncomfortable living in Canada because in Canada, my doctor has the right to kill me in law.
That is shocking.
And I don't feel comfortable. Now, why don't I feel comfortable? You say, Alex, give me a break. You don't believe in killing people. It's not going to affect you. Now you're... No, actually, I'm a human being.
Yes, you are.
As a human being, I could go through a very difficult time in my life emotionally and psychologically, and I might ask for something that I would have never otherwise asked for, because sometimes the law is in place to protect me from myself. That's why we have laws on suicide.
Yes.
Because if this were all right, because if this were all about autonomy, why would we care about someone who kills himself by jumping off a bridge? Now it might make a bit of a mess or something, or it might be upsetting to the first responders who have to deal with that. But I mean, why would we care about that if this were all about autonomy?
Yeah, and we can touch on that in a later part, but I'm just wondering, has there been much improvement then in palliative care in your country? Is this the way forward? There's already pressure here on the NHS budget, where we will now see probably healthcare professionals place an incentive, if this was to pass through, to end lives early. But I'm curious to know what it's like in your country.
Yeah, so it's been a disaster.
Oh gosh.
And it's been a disaster on two sides. First of all, as I already told you, we legalized it in the criminal code.
Yes.
But then healthcare is provincial, so now you had the provincial governments in dealing with, implementing this. Yeah. So because they are responsible for healthcare, they implemented it as a healthcare measure. And how they did it in almost every province is by molding it into the palliative care system. So therefore, for instance, I'm in Ontario. Ontario is the biggest province in Canada. About 39% of Canadians live in Ontario. So it's and then we have Toronto, etc. So it's got a fairly large population. But in Ontario, all of the codes, so the payment codes for a doctor to kill you, are palliative care codes. So it's been mixed in. Now in Ontario, doctors are not forced. I mean, palliative care is not forced to do euthanasia in Ontario. But in British Columbia and Quebec, palliative care is forced to participate in euthanasia. So for instance, the story of the Delta Hospice Society, many people heard about it because what happened is the British Columbia government made an example of the Delta Hospice Society because they refused to kill. They refused to allow euthanasia. Now, just to be very clear, the Delta Hospice Society said we're opposed to doing euthanasia, but it is a legal act. So if someone asks for it, we will transfer them to the hospital, which happened to be right across the street.
Yeah.
It's not that they were saying, oh, by the way, we want you to have euthanasia, therefore we will bring it across the street, but we just won't do it. No, they were saying, no. We will provide you the proper care. You have no need for euthanasia, but if you're going to demand it, you have every right to go to the hospital where they're going to do it to you, which was across the street. But the government said that wasn't good enough. In British Columbia, they said every hospice that is not religiously affiliated, so the few religiously affiliated hospices were exempted from this, must provide euthanasia because you're receiving government money. That's what they said. So because the Delta Hospice Society refused, they were defunded by the government. Their property, which they owned, they had a 10-bed hospice, was expropriated. So the government just took it, even though it was the property of the Delta Hospice Society. The government expropriated it, and then they reopened it as a new Delta Hospice Society run by a different board, which does euthanasia. Quebec is another story. So Quebec last year, so originally Quebec didn't force hospices to have to do euthanasia. Then in June of 2023, they passed this Bill 11 in Quebec. And one of the provisions of Bill 11 was all palliative care and hospice institutions must provide euthanasia. But that included then the St. Raphael Hospice in Montreal, which was built and funded by the Archdiocese of Montreal. So the Archbishop of Montreal took them to court. So, it's all in a kerfuffle right now. I'm not sure how it's all going to come out. But anyway, the fact of it is so just to put this in perspective, the St. Raphael Hospice signed a 100-year contract in 2019 with the Quebec government, which included a provision that they will never have to provide euthanasia. Yeah. But it was owned and operated by the Archdiocese of Montreal. But when Bill 11 passed, the government said that supersedes that contract we signed with you, therefore you must also provide euthanasia. So this is the kind of thing you get. Now, why is that so important? Because we've had lots of palliative care doctors and nurses who have now left palliative care.
And that could happen here in the UK as well. So
we talk about the problem of there's too few medical professionals who are trained to be effective palliative care doctors and nurses. And it takes, when you're training someone to deal with pain and symptom management, it's not just about a course you take that says, in this situation you give them this amount. And it's not just about that. It's also about the experience of dealing with all these different situations and becoming a real expert and how you care for those situations. So obviously these experienced doctors and nurses in palliative care leaving has created a real problem.
For sure, I can imagine. That sounds
And that's what's
horrendous.
going on. So it's really quite a disaster. It's also changed palliative care.
Yeah.
Because when you mix killing in with end-of-life care, it makes it a very, very bad mixture. Because now the question becomes, so I'll give you a quick story, and I know I got a call from one of our supporters in Ottawa, and he was visiting his dad who was in palliative care, and his dad was near to death, so therefore the family all came to visit. And he said, we were all there in the room, and the MAID team, so all major hospitals in Canada that are not religiously affiliated, so all the Catholic hospitals don't do this, but in all other hospitals they have a MAID team. So the purpose of the MAID team is not only to kill you if you ask for it, but it's also to make sure you know it's available to you. So they not only do the act, they sell the act. So the MAID team came, so the MAID team came into the room and asked their dad, do you want euthanasia? And the dad said, no, I'm not interested in euthanasia. He was approaching death. He was not interested. The family then went down for a coffee, but they went to the coffee shop. And they went down for a coffee. And then when they came back into the room, the dad said, you'll never guess what happened as soon as you guys left the room. The MAID team came back in and asked me again. I got a call from this elderly woman in British Columbia, who's a supporter of ours, and she said, my husband is approaching death. How do I get the MAID team to stop asking him if he wants euthanasia? She said they've asked now 5 times.
5 times? Wow, that's insane.
So obviously in this case, here's a man who's approaching death, the one on BC I'm talking about, and you know, obviously he would qualify, because it's not even a controversy that he'd qualify. But why would you keep asking when they're saying no?
And also, are there people who are on that MAID sales team for selling and killing? They're not all doctors, so there's some people probably, is there like a gap there for people who maybe are not fully qualified in the medical field to even just carry out the killing? That makes sense.
They are
cold
doctors.
as it is.
So the law, right? The law allows doctors and nurse practitioners to approve you for MAID in Canada. So therefore, the MAID teams are made up of doctors and nurse practitioners. And I'm assuming, so most of the MAID team are also, so when you look at the data in Canada, there's a bunch of doctors who've done a lot of it, and then there's a few doctors who've done some of it. So they've done a few times. That would be your MAID team, doctors and nurse practitioners who've done a lot of it. So let's say you're living in Toronto and you're in a major hospital in Toronto, and some of those hospitals are massive, and you're a member of the MAID team. So obviously speaking, if you're getting that many patients through, you're probably doing quite a few killings. And so then you see that in the data. And it showed us in the recent data of Ontario, it was something like, I can't remember exactly, but the majority of the deaths were done by very few doctors.
Very few doctors, okay, but just a lot.
Had done a lot.
But
we also have euthanasia clinics in Canada.
Oh my gosh.
And they're pretty wide open, okay? So you get so you talked about Liz Carr earlier. So when she came to Canada, she did that interview with Ellen Wiebe. And Ellen Wiebe's got a euthanasia clinic in Vancouver. And Ellen is like Canada's most prolific killer when it comes to euthanasia.
Oh yes, this is in the documentary. Yeah, she was...
Yeah. She's an interesting one.
Yes, let's be charitable.
She's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Anyway, she's done a lot of them. She had one case where a person from Ottawa was turned down 5 times for euthanasia. Well, if you've been turned down, that means you've been turned down by the MAID team. So you've been turned down by the MAID team. Obviously speaking, you don't qualify. She did an interview with this person over Zoom. She approved this person for euthanasia, right? She got someone else to sign off, so there was a double signature. She got someone else to sign off. Now
would that have to be a doctor to sign off?
Doctor or nurse practitioner.
Doctor, nurse, or nurse practitioner.
But you see, Ellen Wiebe does a lot of euthanasia, so she has a sign-off team. She's got a couple of doctors, nurse practitioners, or she knows who just sign off. Remember, the law doesn't require the person's second sign-off to actually have met you in any way. But in this case, Ellen didn't meet this person. She did it over Zoom. The person then flew to Vancouver, and she's telling the story, and she's admitting she went to the airport, she picked this person up at the airport, she brought the person to her euthanasia clinic where she killed him.
I don't know what to say. I'm just a bit like...
Somebody enjoys killing a bit too much.
Yeah, like it's just too crazy. I don't even have the words, guys. Sometimes I just get lost for words, but that's just so sick. Lord have mercy. There's so much to this I didn't even know about, even when researching these horrific stories. But we do see across TikTok and social media channels that a lot of young people who are diagnosed with depression, autism, eating disorders are turning to euthanasia, and as it's often glamorized as like swift, pain-free, ease, you know, peace and ease vibes, and actually it's not. Well, I think it's not. Will assisted suicide be as swift, as glamorous, as easy peasy, peaceful as people see it as on social media? Will it be a peaceful death? What do you think?
So the application of assisted suicide and euthanasia is a little different, because in the case of euthanasia, the doctor has to be at the death because the doctor is actually doing it to you. It's a homicide. So obviously speaking, they have to be in the room and doing it to you. So what happens is I'll just explain. In Canada, the doctor who then approves you for euthanasia is almost always the same one who does the act. They then put in for this approval, they receive a kit, and in the kit, they have everything they need to kill you in it, okay? That's how it works. I could tell you more stories about this, but anyway, but in that kit, when Canada legalized euthanasia, they looked at some of the data out of the Netherlands, and they recognized that there was a certain failure rate or complications rate within the Netherlands. So what they did is they decided to put in the kit what you call the double dose. So when the doctor actually then hooks you up by IV or injects you, depending on how your veins are and how they decide to do it, if you don't die within about 30 minutes or so, the doctor will then open up the second package that they have, which is the second dose, and they'll inject you again. Now, by doing it that way, it means that there's obviously a fairly low problem rate, because when you've got enough poison in you to kill an elephant, you're probably going to die reasonably quickly. Now, the difficulty becomes in the case of assisted suicide. So I can talk to you next about how these drugs actually work, but it's actually not actually nice how the drugs work. But with assisted suicide, it's a little different because the law requires you to self-administer.
Okay.
So you have to take it yourself.
Pop the pill yourself.
It's not a doctor injecting you. And I'm not saying there's anything good about euthanasia or assisted suicide. There's nothing good about any of it. The point of it is with assisted suicide, when you self-administer, then what they usually do is they put that poison into your favorite drink, and you have to drink it down. So the problem is
it's your favorite drink. I love the way you said that, into your favorite drink.
Well, what I'm saying is it's actually a horrible thing.
Yeah.
If you actually do any reading about this, it's a horrifically caustic. It's a horrific thing. You know, you actually, there's just some videos that have been put out by the euthanasia lobby where they see this person drinking it down, and you know, everybody cheering them on and all this stuff because they're making it.
Yes, there's euthanasia parties as well.
Yeah, the parties, right. So then it's all become this big celebration. You've got the the person there who helped mix it up because they're part of the assisted suicide lobby, and they've got it all ready for you to make sure you take it and the rest of it. And you have the person, trying to drink it, and they're saying, "This is the most horrible, ridiculous thing I've ever had in my life." And the person's saying, "Oh no, take it down. Go see the light." That's how they're talking to you. See the light. Stop. Finish it off, because I know that if you don't finish it off,
it's going to finish you.
You might not die very quick because you have to take it. You have to actually consume it, and it's horrific. It burns your throat.
Oh,
it tastes like absolute ridiculous. It's horrible,
and yet they kill you.
So here's the difficulty with assisted suicide is they sell that at least as freedom because they say you did it yourself.
Yeah. Oh, how empowering.
So say, well, that's freedom. Euthanasia might have more problems because when someone injects you, it might not always be freedom. But with assisted suicide, you have to do it yourself. But it has a higher failure rate, obviously. And I'm saying this to you as people watching, which is not. I'm not justifying killing by euthanasia, because killing by euthanasia has a secondary problem. Now you've got somebody actually injecting you, and right off the bat, we've had these crazy stories out of Canada. These people being injected, and guess what? They say this is about freedom, choice, and autonomy. A lot of these cases don't sound like freedom, choice, or autonomy, and it's never autonomy when someone else is killing you. But anyway, none of this is good because it's about killing. It's all about killing. Yes. People make the mistake also. They'll say, "Oh, well, somebody asked for euthanasia because so I'm not sure if I appreciate or I approve someone killing themselves." They're not killing themselves, they're being killed.
Yeah.
They're missing the point. Someone is killing you.
Yeah.
Then they'll say, well, assisted suicide than killing yourself. Well, no. A doctor is directly involved, and a doctor is agreeing your life is not worth living, and they're prescribing you this awful poison for you to take. And sometimes they're at the death, but if they're not at the death, then you're going to have some assisted suicide volunteer who's all into this because they love being at the death. And they're going to be all into this, and this is all about freedom, choice, and autonomy when they're saying, oh, drink it down, drink it. And you get these people applauding. It's insane.
Yeah.
It's insane.
It's nuts. I have no more words
It's
for it.
craziness. And then they say, oh, this is compassionate. No, this is about abandonment.
Abandonment, yeah.
It's abandoning people in their time of need to kill them.
Yeah,
That's
we're
what
desperate.
it's about.
So ahead of our conversation with you today, we've been asking our viewers what questions they would like answered by an expert on euthanasia, getting to the heart of what concerns them most. So coming in first, we have, is there a connection between abortion and assisted suicide?
So because I only talk about euthanasia and assisted suicide, I don't talk about the abortion issue. And there's a reason I would do that. First of all, not everybody who opposes euthanasia or assisted suicide are against abortion. Yeah. Therefore, you're creating a political problem when you bring abortion into the question. So I would say to people, they should be, everybody in the UK should be visiting their member of parliament and telling them that you want them to oppose the upcoming bill that's coming into your whether it be the Falconer bill or the next bill, which would be the private members bill. They're actually probably going to be somewhat similar in the end because it would make sense politically for them to be similar bills. Because we need to find out how many of these new Labour members of Parliament are actually oppose this. Some of them are actually somewhat neutral on it, meaning they might have an opinion, but they haven't got a strong opinion on it yet. And if you reasonably talk to people, they might say, yeah, I agree with you. So go there as a constituent, talk to them, but don't mix up issues, okay?
Yeah.
So obviously, when we're looking at the question of killing, if you're opposed to killing, you're obviously going to be opposed to euthanasia and assisted suicide, and let's just leave it at that. I'm also opposed to capital punishment. And why am I opposed to capital punishment? I don't think you should ever give the country, the government, the right and law to kill you. I don't think it's safe. Just like I don't think it's safe to give your doctors and nurses the right and law to kill you, I don't think it's safe to give the government the right and law to kill you. I don't think we should ever go there. Even if we're talking about a criminal who did horrific things, you know, I'm not having compassion for the criminal in that sense. I'm simply saying I don't want the government to have the right and law to kill anybody. Sorry.
Another supporter asks, suicide prevention versus suicide promotion. How are Western nations managing to uphold a narrative of working to prevent suicide whilst actively pursuing assisted suicide legislation?
Right, so it creates a real problem, the suicide prevention, suicide promotion thing, in the whole philosophical sense. So it almost becomes like a duplicity. You can't argue one and argue the other. It doesn't make any sense anymore. And I really challenge the suicide prevention organizations because what they're arguing makes no sense at all when they're arguing against suicide, but they're ignoring assisted suicide. So what we've seen in the data, and it's fairly universal, that in pretty much every jurisdiction that's legalized either euthanasia or assisted suicide, we've seen an increase in the other suicide rates, meaning the regular suicide rate. The argument from the other side is, and this is a big argument they make, so that by legalizing euthanasia or assisted suicide, those terrible deaths from people, you know, these terrible suicide deaths will now be eliminated because someone who's terminally ill, who's seeking their way out, won't need to do some horrific act to cause their death. And the data doesn't actually in any way show that. Like if you look at states like Oregon that have had assisted suicide since it's been in place since 1998, you'll actually see that they have had a higher increase in suicide since legalization as compared to other states in the US. So what am I meaning by that? The US has actually seen an increase in suicide rates since 1998 in general. But if you compare Oregon to the national numbers, Oregon's had a greater increase. Now, if you do actually a comparison of Oregon to the states that don't have assisted suicide, that actually even shows you a greater curve. Now, meaning a greater, so states that don't have assisted suicide tend to have had a lower increase of suicide in general. So there's a type of suicide contagion effect that goes on. If you look at the Netherlands, so the Netherlands has had euthanasia in place, like it was legalized in 2001, it came into place in 2002. They actually had it before then also because they had court-made law in the Netherlands. If you compare them to other European countries that have not legalized euthanasia, you see that the Netherlands has actually had a great increase in the rate of suicide, and other countries in Europe that have not legalized, interestingly enough, in Europe they've had a decrease in suicide rates. So you're getting this separation in the rates. So it shows you that there's a type of a suicide contagion effect when you legalize euthanasia or assisted suicide. And I think the reason for that is because in the culture there's a suicide taboo that's naturally in the culture. Yeah. That you don't die by suicide. And you actually see that in polling. So if you look at the polling, most people, if you ask them about all these different questions and you ask them a suicide question, do you support the concept of suicide as a free choice? And if you only talk about suicide, you'll notice that the number is very low, that there's a very natural negative reaction to it. And that's based on the fact that many of us have experienced suicides in our life, and it's been horrific for us. Like I had a friend when I was younger died by suicide. And when it happens again, whenever I bring it up, you get this feeling in your stomach of how horrible that was, and that those horrific, sad, and immense emotional feelings you had when that happened come up again, because we're human. And so people have a natural negative reaction to suicide, which then dissipates when you say, oh, it's okay in this case, or it's okay in that case, and it's never okay.
Yeah, it's never okay. So, another supporter has asked, is euthanasia a cheap and nasty way to find a solution to the future crisis for caring for our elderly?
So the issue of money and euthanasia is actually a very important question, because in Canada we have a healthcare crisis going on, and the things I read about the UK tells me that your NHS is in serious crisis, where there's long waiting lists, serious problems. And so is the government actually offering you this as a form of healthcare reform? And I'm seriously saying that because, everything they've done, like if you look at Canada as an example, so let's say we have a situation where there's long waiting lines for certain types of treatment. What the government will do is they'll say, oh, we'll throw a little bit more money at it. We'll throw a little bit more money at it. It has never solved the problem. But when you add euthanasia to the issue, sadly, it does react in a situation where dead people don't need medical treatment. Dead people don't cost you money, and they don't need medical treatment. So if you had, let's say you have a serious heart condition, and they can do this for you, and you decide, oh, I'm done. I just want assisted death, etc. Well, in our system, you could be approved for that, and guess what? You didn't need whatever it might be. You didn't need that treatment now. Yeah. If you consider cancer. If you need cancer treatment, and let's say you qualify for cancer treatment. So let me actually throw this at you very quickly. I know we've been talking a long time, but there was a study done in Ottawa on people who have, from a doctor who only deals with lung cancer. So this doctor did a study on people who died by euthanasia, who had been diagnosed with lung cancer, and she proved that people who died by euthanasia didn't go for the next set of tests to actually confirm the lung cancer. So they have a preliminary, maybe they did an MRI and it shows you have tumors, etc. They didn't go for the further tests, the biopsy tests and things like that, to actually confirm. The other thing is, of course, if they never went for that, that means they never accepted any treatment. She showed that there was a huge number of them never had any treatment whatsoever. They've been told they have lung cancer. Lung cancer is treatable. But they're not going for treatment. So obviously speaking, then they come out of the system, they save you money and they bring you out. I've estimated, I just wrote an article that in 3 years, between 2021 and the end of 2023, and now this is very conservative estimates, I'm probably way off, it's probably close to $1 billion, but I said using very, very conservative data, we saved at least $568 million in Canada between 2021 and 2023 with our euthanasia law. And that's totally conservative data. So obviously speaking, sadly, yes, there are certain people who recognize that if we do nothing else for the NHS, if you legalize assisted suicide, that will bring some people out of the system, yes.
And surely charities that support the elderly should really be getting on board to speak out against euthanasia as well.
We're really concerned about your country is Marie Curie, one of your big palliative care organizations, is neutral on the question. Even though the Palliative Care Doctors Association is opposed to assisted suicide, they're neutral. And I think that they are foolish. I'm sorry to say that. Sue me if you want. I don't make a lot of money, so I guess you're not going to get much. So the fact of it is that I think they're foolish, because what they're doing is they're saying, oh, we're going to be neutral on the question because then the government will listen to us and will be part of the debate. No, you've now eliminated yourself in the debate, and you've put your doctors and nurses into direct problematic situations because you're not there to say no. Therefore, you're there to say maybe it's okay. And therefore, when your doctors or nurses are going to be pressured, if they legalize, your doctors and nurses are going to be pressured in the future to participate, and they decide to leave palliative care, what are you going to do about it then? Sorry.
Good remark, yeah. Now, drawing to our conclusion, we here in the UK have not yet legalised assisted suicide. We still have time to turn back the clock,
yes, and
to avoid this horror.
Yeah.
And for where we are right now in the UK, what words of advice would you give to encourage us not to go down this path?
The first thing is never to believe the lie that this is only about the very few deaths, because that's what you're going to hear. You're going to be hearing these stories that this is about those very few deaths. There's very few situations. You're going to see those situations in the media. First thing is, yes, you're a human being, so all of our hearts will go out to those situations. We are affected emotionally. It's not that we're not compassionate. We're actually incredibly compassionate. We just recognize you can't kill people. If you start killing people, you can't control it. The second thing I'll say to you is, look at what's happening in Canada. Do you want to go down Canada's route? And then they'll argue, oh, we won't be the same as Canada. Well, they said the same thing in Canada. In 2014 and 2015, you can start pulling up the news articles of our politicians saying, the Quebec Minister of Health, I know it's Quebec, he said he thought there'd be about 100 cases a year.
How many are there?
There was, in Quebec remember, Quebec's got the highest euthanasia rate in the world now. Last year alone, they have more euthanasia in Quebec than we have in Ontario, yet their population is more than a third lower. They last year were at 7.3% of all deaths. I think it was like last year 5,600 whatever it was alone in Quebec. They said it would be for the few cases. Obviously, it's not for the few cases. But of course, they sell it that way because a lot of people are saying, oh, I'm not sure because, I have so-and-so, a friend who's got this condition, and, I'm concerned because they're already receiving some pressure as it is within the system, and it wouldn't be a good idea. Well, no, it's a very bad idea to give someone the right law to kill you. The other thing is those who actually go ahead and do the killings, they have no problem with killing you. Now, some of them are a little bit more careful with it than others, but if you look at the videos of Ellen Weeb talking about this, you can tell she absolutely loves killing you. So are you going to feel safe when you give someone like an Ellen Weeb and a few others like her the right law to kill you? Like, is this a good idea? First of all, it's never a good idea, but some of them actually are going to take advantage of that. When it comes down to it, the reaction is you don't open the door to this. And in all jurisdictions where they've legalized, it's all expanded. And pretty much in every jurisdiction, it's gone crazy. In Canada, it's absolutely nuts. You might say, oh, here in the UK, we're different than that. We're not like Canada. Sorry, you're very similar to us.
But hopefully we can turn it back.
The fact of it is you never legalize it.
Yeah.
We have to make sure that in the UK you get enough of those new Labour members who have been elected to recognize the problem here. So Labour, who tends to be concerned about the little guy, they need to be concerned about these average people who need proper care and who might be feeling pressure to die. And then they should realize, no, this is not a good idea. I have to be concerned about the average so-and-so, our mums and dads who have served our country. One further thing, how this has affected our military in Canada is also crazy. The veterans issue, we didn't even touch on that. These veterans being pressured, they come back from serving our country. Look at Christine Gauthier. She served our country. She becomes injured in service to our country. She's in a wheelchair, And instead of getting her the wheelchair ramp she needs, they offer her medical aid in dying. Think about that. That's insanity. And you don't get to that insanity unless you say it's a good idea to kill. Think
Bizarre.
about it.
Yeah, think about it, guys.
Don't ever go there.
Don't ever go there. I agree. So thank you so much, Alex, for your time. And that was a very informative and insightful interview. So I enjoyed speaking with you today, and all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to Uplift today. Tune in again soon where we'll have more inspiring and uplifting guests for you.